All right, welcome to our video walkthrough of our next chapter, Who is a Novelist? A real quick note, as you read through this chapter, you probably recognized, noticed, experienced some sizable sections where Jane Smiley talks about very specific novels that you may have never read before. I think these sections are still very much worth reading because even if you don't know the very particulars of the books or authors that she's talking about, you can still see how they function as examples of the more sort of intangible ideas she's exploring. If you're interested, the one chapter of this book that we are not going to look at is the final chapter, which is the longest. It is technically speaking almost half, if not a full half of our book, where she writes these mini essays about each of the 100 novels she references at the end of the introduction as having read. So one thing you could do if you wanted to is she goes into some greater detail describing these books. There are spoilers, but talking about her reaction and response to each one. And they are in chronological order in terms of their publication. And so if you want, you can jump to those to get a little bit more insight on the books themselves. You also have the option, of course, of reading those books, but there are a lot of books that she references in this book, and that would be quite the undertaking. I certainly don't expect anybody to have the time or energy to read that much in this 8-week session. But I just wanted to mention that as an option. But I do try to, push back against the impulse, if you experience it, to skip through those sections, because there are still really valuable insights and ideas in there, even if you are not deeply familiar with the primary text that she is talking about. So let's begin with a few things that she talks about across the first, maybe third of this chapter, is what does it take to write a novel? And she starts out right out the gate. The desire to write a novel is the single required prerequisite for writing a novel. This harkens back to what she says in the previous chapter about the only two rules at the beginning and end are get going, get to it. You've got to write. And in a similar way, all it takes to really write a novel is a desire to do so. It's perhaps dangerous for me to say this in an MFA program because you are all enrolled, paying tuition to study writing. But really, if you want to write a book, all you got to do is go write it. As she says, you may not end up with a great book, but you will end up with a book if you sit down and you simply write. But she adds a couple of other things. The second great inspiration for a novelist is language. She goes to some great length talking about the different styles of different writers. We all have a relationship with language, I think. And for me, beyond just coming up with the plot, the ideas, the characters, the things I want to say about the world, the great joy is in thinking about how you use language to do that. So I would certainly, invite you all to think at sort of a metacognitive, reflective level about what it means to you to have a relationship with language. Because I think the reason we choose to write novels partially is that we are in love with using language to convey meaning. And then the third thing is, and I do want to go into this a little bit. She talks about, and these are her words, these are all quotes, obviously. Traditionally, great novelists live dramatic lives. Now, obviously, dramatic can mean a whole lot of different things. She has this lengthy list that starts on page 37 about, the first one, Snorri Sturluson was assassinated. Charlotte Bronte died during pregnancy. And the range here is, all the way to things like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis were famously, and depending on your view of drunks, tragically or heroically and obnoxiously dissipated, right? So what dramatic means looks like a lot of different things. But there is something about their life that inspires them to put words to page about life, about living, about being human. This goes back to what I said before. I'm going to come back to this here in just a minute. And there will be another quote a little later on in our slides that come back to these three things. But these are really the three hearts of things that have to do with writing a novel and what it takes to do so. So I do want to take a step back, and this is probably the most craft-oriented I'm going to get in this chapter's information. This is one of the things I love about Jane Smiley, is she'll be talking at this very sort of meta level and suddenly you'll stumble upon a paragraph that gives some really great insight into things to think about very specific craft components of writing. One of those is characterization and writing characters. And these are all direct quotes. They were big and they were all in one big sequence, so I didn't want to put them in quotation marks. But things to think about with the voice of characters and the things characters are doing. And so these are just worth keeping in the back of your mind as you are crafting and writing your story, is that characters and dialogue are required to more or less move the story along. Why are we getting these conversations with direct speech? What is that doing for the story? The voices of characters are also required to seem authentic. And this is really important. Her example, I'm going to quote her again. The captain of a whaling ship. This is probably a reference to Moby Dick. The captain of a whaling ship must talk as a captain of a whaling ship would talk, with characteristic vocal mannerisms and with typical knowledge. And so thinking about what are the things that you as a writer need to know to make it seem like your characters know them for that authenticity. This is something I see missing with some frequency. So just be thinking about that. And then last, depending upon his role in the novel, though, a character is also required to have something interesting to say that simultaneously deepens the reader's knowledge of him, deepens the reader's knowledge of the other characters, deepens the reader's understanding of the story, and best of all, deepens the reader's knowledge in general, right? Now, what I want to say about this little bit is that these do not all have to happen all the time, all at the same time. But when you have characters in your world, you want to think about the things that they are doing, why they are there. I think about and talk about characters earning their place, right? And to earn your place means to, at various times, accomplish these various things. So you might just think about, as you are creating your cast of characters, how do they do these things? And they can be in very small moments and individualized moments, but you want them to, in some ways, accomplish all of these things. Okay. She says a couple of other really fascinating things about the novelist. And so I'm going to just mention this here. And she breaks each of these down to a certain degree. This idea of various forms of human intelligence. And you're going to notice that these are really like tied to the pillars of good writing. The novelist integrates several forms of human intelligence: verbal intelligence for the style, psychological intelligence for the characters, logical intelligence for the plot, spatial intelligence for the symbolic and metaphorical content as well as the setting, and even musical intelligence for pacing and rhythm. And so we get here some of the big things that I think are at the core of good writing. Style is voice, psychological intelligence, characterization, logical intelligence is the plot, spatial intelligence is symbolic and metaphorical content, that's theme, as well as the setting. And these are, like, to me, the 5 fundamentals of good writing that she's talking about here. And then, of course, we get into musical intelligence, which is pace and rhythm, which is going to look a little different in novels versus short stories versus poetry. But all of these are like the heart of what we do, right? So when we're thinking about the kinds of ways that we bring our human intellect onto the page, we're really taking the various ways that our brains get trained throughout the rest of our lives, both educational, social, personal, career, and bringing them to bear on the way that we write. I just think this is a fascinating way to break that down. And then a couple of other things that span most of the rest of the chapter that I'll talk about here. Again, she's going to do this throughout the book. And so I'm going to pause here and just to sort of meta talk about what she's doing. This book is called 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. So what you're going to end up encountering are a whole bunch of different ways that she defines a novel, right? Because if you remember from our previous chapter, she had those 5 components of being a lengthy prose narrative with a protagonist, right? Here, we're getting a different perspective. A novel is a hypothesis, a dream, a therapeutic act, an ontological construction, and an assertion of self. She's going to dive into various of these at various points throughout her book, but let's just talk about a couple of them here. When we talk about a hypothesis, the author of the narrative hopes to learn something from the exercise. Think about, hopefully at some point you took science, grade school, high school, college. The idea of the scientific method is that scientists have a hypothesis. They want to learn if something is true or not. And like a scientist, they are testing a theory. As she says on page 43, if a novel is a hypothesis, then a novelist is a person with a theory. And then on the subsequent page, it is a theory of being, right? And so this goes back to what I said in our first video about we are examining the human condition and what does it mean to be a human being. And I think that is what she's talking about on page 46 when she says the novelist's job is to develop a theory of how it feels to be alive. What does it mean to live? What is this human experience that we are having? That's where we get to that hypothesis part. Of this definition. A novel persuades, as any argument does, but this is where novels are different from, say, a scientific experiment in a lab or a jury trial where there must be hard evidence. Instead, it uses assertion, sensation, emotion as the elements of the argument, where the argument is what does it mean to experience certain things as a human being. She talks about, and I'm going to quote her again. She goes through this notion of a hypothesis, and that, like, the idea being, what will happen if someone does X, Y, or Z? What if, to reference Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, as she does, what if some uneducated country people were to set out on a journey by wagon to take the corpse of their mother back to her place of origin? And she talks about, like, what happens then? What is that experience like, and how does it tie to our experience of being a human being? So you might think about, like, what is your what if question in your story? And what is it that you are trying to find out about humanity through what you do? And then just a couple of other things that I would like to mention here is the idea of the novelist's life and career that she talks about here. And this is perhaps putting the cart a little before the horse. But as you're thinking long term about who you want to be as a writer and how your career will unspool, so we're kind of thinking long game here. But you might I love this passage. The paradox of a career of novels is that theories are found wanting, specific convictions dissipate. The novelist comes to see things in a different way. This harkens back a little bit to what she says about herself in the introduction about the many books that she'd written, taking very different approaches, different ideas. And that's because, when we think about writing as theory, as testing a theory, we might find that our takes on those theories and our hypotheses and the results of our experiments spool out differently depending on where we are in our lives, right? And this is why I think this list of the 3 inspirations, to come back to this, are so important: literature, language, and life. So literature obviously changes over time, but, like, the books that we read exist. And as she talks about several times in both this and the previous chapter, novels are put to the page and they are there, right? They generally don't change. Obviously, there's different editions of famous books that have undergone shifts and changes, but generally speaking, it's there. That doesn't change as much. Language, yes, our use of language can change, but I think our love of language is pretty set at a certain point in our lives. But life, that thing, is the thing that always changes, right? We become a different person every day. It perhaps is by very, very slight gradations, but eventually, after a certain amount of time, we are a different person from who we were. And that is going to affect those theories that we look at and whether we find them wanting. We come to see things in a different way. And so you might think of your own career as a novelist as this thing that is kind of ever changing and ever shifting as part of your life. And so that's how your work will probably change over the course of your writing life. Okay, that's it. I look forward to seeing what sorts of thoughts and ideas you have in the discussion of this chapter. I obviously left a whole lot out, and I'm sure there are other things that spoke to some people more than others. So I will look forward to seeing what we all have to say about this chapter